Close your eyes and picture an apple. Red, round, maybe a little shiny. You just did that without thinking twice. But for a small percentage of people alive right now, that instruction is impossible, not difficult. Impossible. And for most of history, science had no idea this was even happening. It has a name now, aphantasia, the inability to voluntarily create mental images. But the name is barely a decade old, which raises an obvious question. If somewhere between 1 and 4% of people have never been able to picture anything in their minds, how did nobody notice for this long? Part of the answer is that scientists had actually been measuring this exact thing since 1973 and still managed to miss it. That year, a psychologist named David Marks created something called the Vividness of Visual Imagery Questionnaire, a simple survey asking people to rate how clearly they could picture things, on a scale from as vivid as actual seeing down to no image at all. Thousands of people took it over the following decades. A small number of them every single time circled the lowest possible score. No image at all. For nearly 40 years, that answer sat quietly in research data, treated as a curiosity, a rounding error at the bottom of a chart. Nobody followed up. Nobody asked those specific people what their inner life was actually like. The data was there. Nobody had a reason to look closer. The reason finally arrived through a man named MX. In 2005, a 65-year-old retired building surveyor underwent a minor medical procedure. Afterward, he told his doctor something strange. He said he could no longer picture his wife's face. Not that he'd forgotten what she looked like. He could describe her perfectly. Hair color, height, the shape of her smile. He simply couldn't see her. Not in a dream, not in a daydream, not when he closed his eyes and tried. For a man who, by his own account, had been able to vividly picture things his entire life before the procedure, this felt like losing a sense he never knew he had until it was gone. His case landed on the desk of a cognitive neuroscientist named Adam Zeman at the University of Exeter. Zeman ran MX through a battery of tests, and what he found was strange in a specific way. MX wasn't lying, and he wasn't confused. His memory was intact. His intelligence was intact. He could answer detailed questions about faces, places, objects. He just couldn't generate an image of any of it. His mind's eye, as Zeman put it, had gone dark. Zeman published the case in 2010, and for the first time, doctors had documentation of something that sounded almost impossible. A person who thought entirely in words and facts, with zero visual imagination at all. But then something happened that Zeman didn't expect. After the paper came out, he started getting emails, hundreds of them, not from people who'd suffered an injury like MX, from people who said this described their entire life. They'd never once been able to picture anything, not since childhood, not ever, and they'd simply assumed everyone else was speaking in metaphor when they talked about seeing things in their mind. Zeman coined a term for this in 2015, aphantasia, from the Greek for without imagination. And once the term existed, once people finally had language for what they were experiencing, the emails didn't stop. They multiplied. Here's what's strange about that timeline. This wasn't a new disorder. It wasn't spreading. It had almost certainly always existed, at roughly the same rate, in roughly the same percentage of people. For as long as humans have existed, sitting undetected inside 40 years of questionnaire data, what changed wasn't the condition. What changed was that, for the first time, people had a word for a gap they'd spent their entire lives quietly working around. Think about how deep that gap could run without anyone noticing. Someone with aphantasia can still describe a beach in perfect, vivid detail. They know the sand is warm. They know the water is blue. They can write you a paragraph about it that sounds like poetry, but none of that comes from seeing it in their mind. It comes from something closer to a filing system. Facts stored as facts, not as pictures. This is why aphantasia went undetected for so long. Language gave people a way to fake fluency in an experience they never actually had. When someone says, "Picture a beach," and you respond with a beautiful description, nobody checks whether you actually pictured anything. They just assume you did, because you sounded like you did. In 2015, researchers at the University of Exeter, working with Zeman's team, ran an experiment designed to catch this gap directly. They showed participants a series of images, then asked them to imagine those same images later while measuring something the participants couldn't consciously control: their pupils. In people without aphantasia, imagining a bright scene, like a sunlit field, causes the pupils to physically constrict, almost exactly the way they would if the person were actually looking at something bright. The brain's visual system responds to imagined light as if it were real light. But in people with aphantasia, this response barely happened at all. Their pupils stayed still, whether they imagined a bright scene or a dark one. Their visual imagination system, whatever it was doing, wasn't triggering the same physical reflex. This was the first hard, measurable, involuntary proof that something genuinely different was happening inside these brains. Something the person couldn't fake and couldn't consciously control, and it lined up perfectly with what they'd been describing all along. So what's actually different in there? Brain imaging gives a partial answer. When most people visualize something, a network involving the visual cortex activates almost as if they were seeing it. In people with aphantasia, that same network shows dramatically reduced activity during imagination tasks, even though it works completely normally when they're looking at something real. The hardware for seeing is fine. The software for imagining seeing is running with the volume turned down, sometimes almost all the way off. There's also a family pattern that researchers are only starting to map. In surveys of people with aphantasia, roughly a third report having a close relative with the same condition, far higher than chance would predict. Nobody has isolated a specific gene responsible for it yet, but the clustering suggests this isn't purely random wiring. It may be something closer to being left-handed or colorblind, a variation quietly passed down through families for generations, never discussed because nobody realized there was anything to discuss. And here's where it gets stranger. Aphantasia doesn't just affect pictures. Many people with the condition also report no inner soundtrack, no mental replay of a song, no imagined voice reading a book to them as they read it silently. Some report they can't even conjure a smell or a taste in their mind, not the way most people can imagine the scent of coffee or the taste of salt. For some, it's not just an absence of mental pictures, it's an absence of an entire inner sensory world that most people never even question they have. And on the opposite end of this spectrum, there's something almost nobody has heard of: hyperphantasia. People whose mental images are so vivid, they're barely distinguishable from actual sight. A 2020 study led by Siemens' team, surveying thousands of people across the full spectrum, found that hyperphantastic individuals didn't just score higher on vividness, they described a qualitatively different experience entirely. Some report that imagining a lemon makes their mouth water, exactly the way biting into a real one would. Others say they can't watch a sad scene in a book without their body reacting as if they were physically present in it. Their inner world isn't a filing system. It's closer to a screening room, running at full resolution, all day, uninvited, which means human minds aren't running one shared operating system with a fixed interface. They're running wildly different versions, and almost nobody knows which version anyone else has. This raises an uncomfortable possibility. If something this fundamental, whether or not you have an inner theater running behind your own eyes, could sit undetected in survey data for 40 years, go unnoticed by science until 2010, and unnamed until 2015, what else are we all assuming everyone else experiences the exact same way, purely because we've never had a reason to ask? You've spent your entire life describing your inner world, using words borrowed from other people, on the assumption that "picture it in your mind" means the same thing to everyone who hears it. For some people, it always has. For others, it has never once meant anything at all, and they never had a reason to say so, because nobody ever asked, and there was never a word for what they were missing.